If you don't mind, I'll be speaking so I can see more of the audience instead of being sitting and not seeing you. First of all, I want to thank author Jocelyn and the Institute for inviting me, for organizing this symposium today. This is such a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank you. This is an honor to be here, and I'm thankful for you to be here also tonight on this very busy life that we have. Okay. When I got the invitation, I also received a very subtle instruction asking me to come up with a very catchy title and paper. So when I wrote History as a GPS, I was trying to answer a more fundamental question, which is, what is history for? When I wrote Thinking Historically 10 years ago, my goal was to help develop the ability in the student to think critically about the past. And while I think this is still fundamental, what I'm trying to do today with you is something a little bit different. Because I think history is for also helping students to develop their ability to create meaningful historical narrative of the collective past in which they live, and help them shape their way of situating themselves in place and time. Now, let me start with two quotes on the nature of narrative, of historical narrative. First one is from Aidan White. Aidan White says, to raise the question of the nature of narrative is to invite reflection on the very nature of culture, and possibly even on the nature of humanity itself. Then Jörn Roosens says, narrative creates the field where history lives its cultural life in the minds of the people, telling them who they are and what the temporal change of themselves and their world is all about. Now, what is your initial reaction to these quotes? As history educators, we tend to have reservation when we hear the word narrative or story, because we fear we're about to be told stories that are narrow, simplistic, or unreflective. And we react this way not without some evidence in hand. In fact, several studies have revealed how narrative have been used in schools all around the world to promote unreflective nationalist ideologies. In his book, Lies That My Teachers Told Me, James Loewen explored how American students typically learn boring stories that are predictable. Every problem has already been solved or is about to be solved. These stories exclude conflict and real suspense. They leave out anything that might reflect badly upon our national characters. Even when they try for drama, they achieve only melodrama, because the reader knows that everything will just turn out fine in the end. In many countries, learning history is still equated with learning historical narrative. The basic expectation in this jurisdiction is that students will gradually be able to reproduce the narrative that they learn in class. This practice is reinforced by approved textbook, national assessment, and even national leaders and advocacy groups. So in this context, questions of history education are easily turned into history wars over what stories of the past should we tell students. But it doesn't have to be this way. Interestingly, narrative has long been credited in the literature for being a fundamental structure of human experience. Psychologist Jerome Bruner says, narrative is a mode of thought of natural kind that spontaneously come into existence in the functioning of human beings. It provides a fundamental way of organizing representations in memory and of filtering the perceptual world. Moving it to a more social level, Aidan White contends that to discuss the nature of narrative is to reflect on the very nature of culture itself. So natural is the need to narrate that the notion of narrativity would be problematic only in civilizations in which narration would be absent from culture. German historian Jörn Roosens agrees. He says, narrating history plays an essential role in shaping our individual and collective consciousness. The function of narrative, in Roosens' view, is precisely to transform the past into history by giving meaning and direction to otherwise disorganized and messy action and events from the past. Narrative does have a necessary practical function in life. It confers to realities a temporal direction, an orientation which guide our actions in reference to past actualities, what I call a usable past, a past that we can use in the present to position ourselves and orient ourselves. But it also occurs in our own internal subjectivity. Narrative gives us a self-understanding and awareness of our own existence as individual, as collectivities, beyond death and birth. So, far from being an oversimplification, narrative, historical narrative, would be a linguistic form and also a cognitive form that would allow us to realize the function of orientations. Actually, narrative would be a solution to how we translate knowing into telling. I guess we can discuss that later in the discussion. So from this perspective, our ability to make sense of the past or contemporary life would have some kind of a narrative competence. And this can be loosely defined in Jürgen Straub's term as a linguistic and cognitive ability to structure a text as a story. And in recent years, history educator in Germany, in Sweden, in Australia, in other places are looking at how students and also adults develop narrative understanding of the collective past. Unfortunately, Canadian educators are only starting to investigate this. Until recently, the focus in Canada was very much, as Jocelyn mentioned, focused on conflicting national stories of the past between, in particular, French and the English. Because, as it's generally taught in Canada, young Canadians know very little. The argument is commonly framed around poor memory recall of students with regards to substantive content knowledge of the nation. Who was the first Prime Minister of Canada? In what year was the War of 1812? These are recurring questions every year that come out on Canada Day, on Remembrance Day. The kinds of things that we believe young Canadians need to know. And often they don't. And then, as a result of that, we have organizations like Historical Canada, who then lobby publicly the government to change curricula, to improve, so that as a result of this, we end up teaching more national history. Unfortunately, we spend so much time surveying students on what they don't know that we barely know anything about what they do know about the past. And the result is that so far, most of the research that was done in history education in Canada looked pretty much at substantive content knowledge that we think students ought to know and is evaluated in formal evaluation at the ministry level. But a growing number of researchers in Canada, including Jocelyn, who started this project on the narration of students' thinking, are looking instead at a more basic question, which is, how do students narrate the history of the nation? through such a question, it becomes possible to venture into the minds and thinking of the learners. Question of knowledge contribute to an important facets of historical consciousness, but they don't tell us in any sophisticated way how they use that knowledge. So narrative is a way to see how they mobilize those bits and pieces into a story form that they can use to orient themselves in time, but also build their own sense of belonging and attachment to the community. So, what we did, as Jocelyn mentioned, is that we conducted a number of studies in Canada, and the task was designed to study both narrative knowledge of the content and thinking jointly with the following directive: tell us the history of the nation as you know it. And it did change because we look at different provinces. We did look at Quebec, and then there was a study done in the province of New Brunswick with the Acadians, and then we are in the process of doing it. We already started in Ontario as well. But the question more or less remained the same, and the aim is to investigate the structure and quality of students' narrative and their sense of consciousness as member of a nation. While this undertaking may appear very easy, tell us the history of the nation, it's far more complex than anticipated. As Rusin stresses, the active reconstruction of history is the core engagement of history with the past. By asking students to tell the history of the nation, we want to investigate the structure and quality of student narrative, but by the same occasion, looking at their sense of historical consciousness as a member of a community, of a nation. While most countries around the world teach national history, the idea of the nation is never understood in the exact same terms, even within a nation, because the concept is not ontological. It's not fixed in time, nor acquired at birth. In fact, I'm just going to put here a little quote from French philosopher Ernest Renan. You know Ernest Renan, who wrote 19th century, Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? What's a nation? Well, Renan says a nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Two things which, properly speaking, are really one and the same constitute the soul, the spiritual principle. One is the past, and the other is the present. One is the possession in common of a rich legacy of memories, and the other is present consent, the desire to live together, the desire to continue to invest in the heritage that we have jointly received. Most studies on the teaching and learning of national history are very theoretical in nature or look precisely at content of what this nation is about. But very few actually look at what kids think about the nation when we ask them to put it in story form. So what the findings from the studies that have been done in Quebec, in Ontario, and in New Brunswick tell us are very revealing. Actually, how students narrate the past has been looked at in three different ways. First of all, it's been looked at in terms of the content, the substantive content of the stories. Most of the results of this research being done has looked at this. The second aspect we're looking at, which is the student themselves. Who are they? What kind of stories do they tell? So who is the identity of the narrator? And the last aspect is the narration itself, the act of narrating the past. What does it mean to write a story? So, the first thing that comes up is about the substantive content of those stories. So what our studies are revealing is that students are far from being historically amnesiac. Participants produced very, in general, coherent and logical narrative presenting fascinating historical information, often ignored or not captured in survey forms. And what is even more interesting is that the majority of these stories are not focused primarily or exclusively on the present or the modern period of Canadian history. In fact, most narratives begin with the arrival of French European explorer in the 15 and 1600s. Overall, one is struck by the very Eurocentric nature of their story. As one Quebec student put it, very bluntly, at the beginning there was not much. Only Indians lived here. That's very typical of the stories that they tell. Canada starts with the explorers and colonization. Very few talk about Canada before that, with the hundreds and hundreds of years of civilization with the Aboriginal people. Very few do that. But perhaps more interestingly are the key events around which those narratives are structured. In either Quebec, Ontario, or New Brunswick, the majority of students arrange their stories around key, pivotal, traumatic events in Canadian history. In Quebec, it's the British conquest of New France in 1759. It's when the English take over. In Ontario, it's not the conquest. It's the imposition of English-only education to Francophone students. Because we surveyed the Francophones here, right? So it's Regulation 17, which in history banned French as a public education language and schooling opportunity. And then in New Brunswick, with the Acadian, it's nothing to do with that. It's the deportation of Acadian by the bad and British authorities in 1755, who took all the Acadian out of Acadia and sent them all over the world. Some ended up in Louisiana, and some as far as Australia. So that's the single most cited event, depending on the province that they use to frame their stories. Now, what's interesting is that because they put it in a story, we get a sense of how they use those events. Because if you just quiz them on these, they will tell you what the event is. But now we can see how they're using them. And interestingly, these episodes are not presented as isolated occurrences in history. Rather, they're part of a distinctive narrative orientation, a central element of rupture. You can move. In the history of Canada. Interestingly, their story very much follows a template, which is, I put it on a graph, which is like this. There's an initial moment, which is the arrival of European, a time of progress. But then there is a big crisis happening. It's the pivotal point. And this changes according to the group. In Quebec, it's the conquest. In New Brunswick, the deportation. And then it's a long, long, long slope of miserable, miserable life under the British rule.
And the Canadians.
And then, somehow, there is an awakening. We're fighting for ourselves. We are strong again. We're able to regain some rights. But then, there is the uncertainty of the present. Where are we going? Where are we headed? Kids tend to go in 3 different directions, which I'm not going to get into now. But they have a view of this past to the present. Okay, of course not every student offered narrative around this line. This is a line which is adopted as a majority, but not every student followed this narrative template. Some students, roughly a third, did not follow the template or didn't even write a story whatsoever. They came up with either a list, present-day elements, but not a story. So this leads me to the second point. Who are the students who provided us those stories? Well, work in history and psychology are suggesting that narrators are important. In fact, what narrators say is as much about themselves as about the world they wish to describe. As British historian E.H. Carr famously said, before studying history, study the historian. So, instead of looking just at the content, why don't we look at the students? Who are they? What we found is very telling so far. How students define themselves in reference to a particular group very much affect the content and structure. And it goes back to some of the elements you talked about. The more students identified strongly with the nation, and we didn't force them to identify, they had to choose. They had to tell us to what extent they identify with the nation on a scale. And the more they identified with the nation, the longer and richer was the narrative. In other words, those who really feel attached and feel they belong to the nation are those who are producing the longer text. More events, more British troops, more traumas. They put more. And the more they identify strongly with the nation, the more also is militant. The story is more militant. It's not just a story as description. It's a story where they make justification as well. Interestingly, you see this. This is just in terms of showing you the data. The more they identify, so those are the strong identification with the nation, depending on how they define it, the more they have stories, what I call the just cause. It's they're fighting for something. The nation is worth preserving and fighting for. The more they do say that. And the less they belong, the more they provide a very generic story of Canada, which is often very presentist in its view. Another thing we found is that a strong sense of identification with the nation also affect the kind of words they use in the story. The words community, culture, and history are used more with students who identify strongly with the nation. In the same way, the first person plural, us, we, is used 60% more by students who identify strongly with the nation. So what this means, for instance, is that, as an example, the conquest. The British conquered New France in 1759 and adopted assimilation policies toward the French settler of the time. That's a fair statement. Now look how students who identify strongly put it. When the English landed, they tried to assimilate us. In vain. They didn't win. But they dominated us for a long time. Since then, we have our own government. We can vote for. But this is not really famous either. You see here this idea of the us versus them, this dichotomy. The more they identify with the nation, the more they tend to write story, and in-group, out-group, the more they do that. Now, our analysis is clearly at an initial stage, but clearly what we see is that the ability to create a narrative of the nation and to ascribe to it a particular vision entails the interweaving of one's own identity into the concrete wrap and woof of historical knowledge. Students who felt most attached to the nation were those who equally produced the more nationalist, militant historical narrative, often phrased in the first person plural. And these were largely informed by information coming from collective memory that they get not necessarily in the school, but outside of the school system. History is always a process of making sense of the past to the present. But it could be very misleading if the we, us, today contemporary citizen, think that we were the actors of the time. This presentist conflation is highly problematic, contrary to historical thinking and the necessity of perspective taking. How am I doing? So the last aspect, briefly, that I want to talk about, which has been understudied, underexplored. When we ask students to tell the history of the nation, what are they supposed to do? Well, interestingly, historians, philosophers, history educator make ample use of the term, often interchangeably. narrative, accounts, story. But few actually provide their own understanding and definition of what is a historical narrative. As an example, my colleague Weinberg says in his book, Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Act, in our attempt to get students to ask questions, they take the form of providing them with alternative accounts, competing narratives, or even textbook in which a narrative is presented, then commented upon by historians who represent different perspectives. In this sentence, Weinberg makes reference to no less than three concepts: alternative accounts, competing narrative, and different perspective. But never does Weinberg explain to the reader what he actually refers to when he talks about narrative, stories, perspective. The reality is that theorists talk about the topic, they talk around the topic, but they don't often stop just to tell us what the topic is about. Narratives are central to history. They transform the past into meaningful story. They structure how we make sense of the dimension of time. History educators, I think, urgently need what I would call a narrative grammar. What does it mean to produce a text in story form? Actually, Jürgen Stroff says that narratives are understood as verbal and textual unit with an identifiable format structure. The story schema represent the cognitive aspects of the narrative competence. This includes not least all those acts of memory and recall that have a narrative structure that needs to be embedded, mentally represented in the story. So briefly, what he says is that there are some criteria that help historians structure historical narrative. And then, just briefly, he provides us with three elements that help structure a narrative, a historical narrative, in a way that other kinds of texts do not. First, a narrative is a series of related events organized into a coherent sequence. A narrative exists through particular events chosen for their significance and linked together in a verbal causal chain. In its loosest form, the sequence has the structure of the annals. Events are listed and connected in mere chronological order, with a very present analyst view. In its more advanced scholarly form, the sequence of events is shaped by a retrospective and prospective view of the events. In other words, coherence is acquired by virtue of the fact that the historian takes into account the events that preceded and followed that the one he looks at. And he does it with hindsight. He is looking back at the events after all of this takes place. So, for example, historians can write a narrative of, say, D-Day, taking into account previous and subsequent battle, and with reference to the colligatory concept of World War II, something hardly possible in an analyst's view, because the historians write it with 50, 60, 70 years of perspective on it. The second element is an intention to involve the reader in the narrated event. Narrative always places the narrator and the audience in a form of relationships. Stories are not simply told. They are read and shared. As such, they invite others to appreciate a particular conception of historical realities. This implicit relationship creates a basis for consensual judgment, coordinated and cooperative action. And then the last element is the internal structure that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which postmodernists totally disagree with, because they say that when we do that, we're actually imposing on the past a structure which never existed. So a central difference between the past and history is that the past is not organized, is messy, while history is an account, the story of that past. So narrative must have a structure with a starting point in time. So when a student says, it all started with the defeat, well, this student purposely select a point in time to start the story. The story starts with the defeat. And it helps structure what follows. In the same way, a narrative just doesn't go on forever. It has to stop. But it just doesn't stop. It comes to a conclusion. So the ending, like the beginning, is chosen for its significance, for its revealing aspect of the narrative. Perhaps more complex is the middle of the story. What do we put between the beginning and the end that makes it a story? Well, actually, these three elements are very useful, but perhaps we're missing something here that helps us understand exactly all the elements that make the features of historical narrative. And as a result of this, Arthur Chapman claims that one of the reasons that we have problems trying to pinpoint exactly what historical narrative are is that historical narrative vary widely. And one reason is that narrative achieve distinctive purposes or tasks in life. So he says that understanding the nature of narrative necessarily entails another feature. Understanding that narrative are different kinds and work in different ways. So relying on the work of Alan McGill, he notes that narrative can accomplish and can be compared at a formal level in terms of generic tasks that they aim to accomplish. So I put them here on the table. One task is the descriptive task, describing a particular aspect of reality, telling what was the case. At another level, the task could be explanation. So explaining why an event or a phenomenon came to be. And then at level 4, it becomes an argumentation, a justification, describing, explaining claim by supporting argument to support them. And each of these tasks are associated with a set of questions, which I'm not going to address now. So, these are very useful because they help us understand more when we ask students to provide us a story of the nation. What should they be doing? What kind of things should we expect them? If we look at the element that Chapman talks about, we expect historical narrative then that will follow or offer some descriptive statements, some facts about the nation. We also expect them to explain what happened in the past of the nation and then attribute significance and meaning to those selected happenings. And ultimately, we want students to make an argument that will provide us with justification for the particular orientation and vision of history. So, in other words, when we want students to produce a coherent story of the nation, we implicitly have in mind a particular way that we expect students to produce their story. But part of the current challenge in Canadian education is precisely the fact that students, and even educators themselves, do not work with clear understanding of what historical narrative are and what they entail. As a result, kids often adopt structures and vision that are familiar to them, that they take from different cultural artifacts in life. So, in conclusion, if I had to sum up the current situation with our research, I would tell you this. Students are not historically ignorant, and they are not incompetent at writing narrative of the collective past. They can do it, and we know that they can be very effective at doing it. But, at the same time, students do not get in our school system an extensive familiarity with narrative, what they are, how they're constructed, and for what purpose or task. In other words, teachers use narrative in class to teach. The textbook is often framed in narrative. They may use a movie which is framed in a narrative, but students never get extensive familiarity with the very nature of what they are. And as a result of that, students do not work with a clear understanding of what historical narrative entails and do. They don't know that. They use them, but they don't have a clear understanding. And because of this, next one, students tend to adopt narrative structures and vision already familiar to them, particularly the one from collective memory. So they use a template. The template I show you is not the template of historiography. No historians in the 21st century write Canadian history this way. But collective memory is still framed around that template. And so often kids will adopt narrative structures and template familiar to them because they don't necessarily know how they work. So as a result of this, and that's the last point, I think we need to educate students to develop a narrative competence, an ability to know how to create a historical narrative of the collective past. We need to remind ourselves, as U.S. colleague Landon Calder observed, that we do not study the past to become walking encyclopedias. Historical learning should be viewed as a process of structural change in our ability to orient ourselves in the course of time. Its value, its fundamental value, Denis Chamil says, is in a big picture that provides perspective to present and allow us to act in life as a member of community. So history from this perspective is clearly a form of GPS. Thank you.